Good evening and welcome to another exciting Blake Society event. And I'm especially excited tonight because we have Dr. Mark Crosby, who popped up not so long ago on the Today programme, talking about some fantastic discoveries that he'd made of previously unseen engravings. And Mark may have more surprises for us tonight. Mark's main area of research is the Romantic period, literary and visual culture. His most recent research led to the discovery of William Blake's earliest engraved art, which I was just referring to, and the reconstruction of the hanging arrangement of Blake's 18 portraits of poets. Mark's edited an edition of Blake's Songs of Innocence, Bodleian 2024, and co-authored with Robert N. Essick the first critical edition of William Blake's Genesis manuscript, 2012. Mark also co-edited Re-Envisioning Blake, Palgrave, 2012, and William Blake's manuscripts, Praxis, Puzzles and Palimpsests. That's a tongue twister, Palgrave 2024. I really fancy that one. That just sounds, I mean, they all sound brilliant, but that one sounds right up my street. Mark is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, a contributor to Branch, Britain Representation and 19th Century History. He's an editorial advisor to 19th Century Literature Criticism Series and Poetry Criticism Series. He's also an associate editor for the William Blake Archive, that fantastic resource that I'm sure everyone in the audience is aware of. It's the largest and most comprehensive free-to-access digital repository of Blake's works on the web, greater even than the Blake Society website. When Mark suggested that the title of this event should be Some Mornings Blake Drank His Coffee by the Tomb of Edward the Confessor, I realised that we were dealing not only with an eminent authority on Blake, but also someone with a great sense of humour and impeccable musical taste. For those not in the know, Mark was referencing The's recent single, Some Mornings I Drink My Coffee by the Grave of William Blake. If you're not familiar with that is to say Matt Johnson's brilliant music, Mark and I would strongly recommend it to you. I think the Blakes would also appreciate the. Mark, thank you so much for talking to us this evening and welcome.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I will highly recommend this book. It's a bargain.
That looks absolutely delightful. So, Mark, without further ado, because I've already said far too much, but most of it was very important. So if people keep their cameras off and audio off, we can make a start. So, Mark, please take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen with you. So hopefully everyone can see the screen.
Not quite yet, Mark.
Okay. Try this again.
Yep, got it now. Brilliant.
Fantastic. Okay, so Blake embarked upon his apprenticeship after studying for 4 years at Henry Pars's drawing school on the Strand. According to Frederick Tatum, a close friend of Blake's during his later years, Blake's father, as we know, a hosier by trade, was so impressed by his son's artistic ability that a painter of eminence was sought to tutor the precocious teenager. The high cost of this proposed tutelage and the ensuing financial repercussions for his family led the young Blake to request instead that he learn the less prestigious and significantly less expensive trade of engraving. The first engraver Blake's father approached was William Wynne Ryland, who was an extremely successful engraver and printseller. He had studied in France and on returning to England popularized the French chalk or stipple manner of engraving. This was a style that became very fashionable very quickly and almost certainly led to Ryland's appointment as engraver to George III. One consequence of this appointment was that Ryland charged relatively high fees, roughly about £100, to take on an apprentice. It wasn't the high fees, however, that deterred Blake's father from apprenticing his son to Ryland. According to Blake's Victorian biographer, Alexander Gilchrist, after being introduced to his proposed master, the teenage Blake stated, "I do not like this man's face. It looks as if he'll live to be hanged." 10 years after Blake made this remark, Ryland was convicted of forging East India Company bills and was sentenced to death by hanging at Tyburn. After this false start, Blake's father approached the master engraver James Basire. This time, his son had no objections, and in August 1772, a few weeks shy of his 15th birthday, Blake was apprenticed to James Basire for the sum of £52. Basire was born on the 6th of October 1730 in London, and he followed in the professional footsteps of his father Isaac, who was also a successful line engraver. While the father specialised in maps and city views, the son's output was broader in style and subject, ranging from large historical prints to book illustrations and contemporary portraits. Basire studied the rudiments of engraving firstly from Richard William Seal and then under the tutorship of the artist engraver and antiquarian Richard Dalton. With Dalton, Basire spent time in Rome, sketching the designs after Raphael and Michelangelo's frescoes in the Vatican, and it was during this trip that the apprentice engraver was introduced to some of his future employers, such as Thomas Brand Hollis and James Stewart, who later commissioned Basire to engrave numerous plates for the monumental and influential studies, The Antiquities of Athens. And as we may know, Blake also engraved 4 plates for the 3rd volume of The Antiquities of Athens. On the 3rd of December 1752, Basire completed his apprenticeship under Dalton and was granted the freedom of the Company of Stationers, which allowed him to establish a copy engraving business in Fetter Lane before moving to Great Street, Queen Street, where he took on apprentices. Now, I'd like to pause here briefly to offer a flavour of Great Queen Street and its milieu during the period. It was a bustling thoroughfare connecting St Martin's in the Field and Lincoln's Inn Field parishes. It was an affluent and fashionable neighbourhood bordered by Covent Garden, Drury Lane and its theatre to the west, and one of the great Inns of Courts to the east. The street was lined with ornately fenestrated Georgian townhouses of 4 to 5 stories. In 1775, the Premier Grand Lodge of Freemasons purchased 2 of these houses, separated by a garden on the south side of the street. In the garden, a hall was built for Masonic meetings, and the house fronting the street became the Freemasons' Tavern and coffee shop. During the London season, Freemasons' Hall was a popular venue for concerts, balls, literary readings, and hosted numerous progressive societies, including the Anti-Slavery Society. Many of the houses lining Great Queen Street were residential, although various commercial businesses operated out of the street-level rooms. During the period of Blake's apprenticeship, there were 3 booksellers plying their trade in Great Queen Street, offering a range of titles that appealed to the mix of fashionable society that frequented the area, from popular plays performed at Drury Lane Theatre to legal, historical, and philosophical texts. In addition, the Freemasons' Hall was often the only venue in London where tracts relating to the various lectures and meetings held in the hall could be purchased, including pamphlets that anticipate Mary Wollstonecraft's vindications of the rights of a woman by a decade or so. The street also boasted a chapel that, like Freemasons' Hall, was socially progressive. In 1774, for example, Thomas Franklin, the minister of Great Queen Street Chapel and the chaplain in ordinary to George III, preached against the harsh punishment meted out to debtors and their families. The progressive flavour of the street attracted artists, including the portrait painter Arthur Devis, whose atelier was frequented by wealthy patrons. Devis's conversation pieces, well considered out of fashion by the late 1770s, were exhibited along with his son's paintings at the Society of Artists' annual exhibitions. At around the same time, the painter and future Royal Academician John Opie took up residence on Great Queen Street as he sought to establish himself in the London art scene. The engraver and actor Edward Rooker, who was noted for his engraved views of London and for his role as a harlequin at Drury Lane Theatre, occasionally sold prints from the Freemasons' Hall. Many of Rooker's engravings, particularly the landscapes, were after drawings by William Pars, the brother of Blake's drawing tutor Henry. In addition to artists, there were surveyors, advocates with chambers at Lincoln's Inn, an auctioneer, as well as purveyors of luxury goods like tea. There was one other notable resident of Great Queen Street at this time, Blake's future patron, William Hayley. Now, on this slide, Hayley is the chap in the middle with holding with his right hand, head resting on his right hand. Hayley lived with his mother in a house on Great Queen Street. In his memoirs, Hayley describes the house as lofty and commodious and believed it to be the former residence of the celebrated painter Godfrey Kneller. Now, Hayley isn't exact when it comes to the dates when he was in this residence, but it seems that he lived in Great Queen Street from roughly around 1767 to at least 1773. So there is a brief overlap with Blake's own residence on Great Queen Street. Basire's house was number 31, Great Queen Street. It was on the north side of the street and not too far from Drury Lane. Basire initially shared the premises with a fellow line engraver, a chap called Alexander Bannerman. Now, anticipating Blake's future partnership with James Parker in the 1780s, much of Basire and Bannerman's engraving work overlapped. Both advertised themselves as history and architecture engravers in a 1763 trade directory. They were frequently commissioned by John Boydell to illustrate his publications, and they also worked on portrait engravings and regularly exhibited at the Society of Artists. By 1766, Bannerman had moved to Fountain Court, just off the Strand, where, coincidentally, Blake would also reside almost 60 years later. Number 31, Great Queen Street, was a spacious, multi-floor building in keeping with the other houses lining the thoroughfare. Like the commercial enterprises in the neighbourhood, Basire's engraving workshop would have occupied the street floor level, while the upper floors were largely residential. Basire's workshop, like other contemporary engraving studios, would have had at least one copperplate rolling press from which to print proof impressions. There would have been benches for engraving and etching located near windows to afford as much natural daylight as possible. There would have been an area for hanging impressions to dry once printed, as well as storage spaces for all the paraphernalia associated with printmaking, such as copper plates, hammers, files, and other assorted tools to prepare plates, stock paper, etching, and also engraving tools. There had also been an area for the acid used to etch the plates, daubers to ink the plates, and pigments and oils to make up the inks. There was also an area of the workshop, almost certainly at the front of the premises, that was dedicated to displaying and selling prints. According to Gilchrist, at some point between 1772 and 1774, Blake saw the author Oliver Goldsmith perusing prints at Blake's workshop and mightily admired the great author's finely marked head. Now, the prints issuing from Basire's workshop were predominantly line engravings executed using the mixed method of preliminary etching followed by engraving. Basire's robust style of linear engraving was markedly different from many of his contemporaries, including Ryland. Unlike the fashionable aesthetic produced by stipple engraving or mezzotint, Blake used a variety of linear patterns to represent form and tone. It was an extremely time-consuming technique that took patience and skill to master, and while not fashionable, the linear style ensured that the print was faithful to the original painting or drawing. Indeed, Basire's style of line engraving was so precise that the first director of the Society of Antiquaries, Richard Gough, claimed that Mr. James Basire's burin will do credit to every individual or body of men who employ it. This ability to provide accurate reproductions led to Basire succeeding George Virtue as engraver to the Society of Antiquaries in 1755, and his later appointment as engraver to the Royal Society in 1770. In addition, Basire was also a member of the Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, and regularly submitted work to their exhibitions. While much of Basire's work came from the Society of Antiquaries and the Royal Society, particularly the illustrations for their respective journals, his workshop produced a broad range of prints that appealed to different tastes, from illustrations in popular journals like the European Magazine and portrait engravings of aristocrats and notable literary figures like Andrew Marvell, John Dryden, and James Thomson, author of one of the most popular poems of the period, The Seasons. Many of these portrait engravings were exhibited at the Society of Artists. Basire was also a specialist in executing large-scale prints, such as his stoning of St. Stephen after Raphael, and the engraving of Benjamin West's famous painting Pylades and Orestes in 1771. Beginning in the early 1770s, Basire was also commissioned by the Society of Antiquaries to engrave a series of large engravings of paintings depicting scenes from the lives of Henry VIII and Edward VI. Part of Basire's work for the Society of Antiquaries also involved illustrating the Society's sponsored publications. These included, as I've already mentioned, Stewart and Revett's The Antiquities of Athens, as well as the occasional papers known as Vetusta Monumenta, and volumes on the history of various English towns and their counties, as well as Richard Gough's influential British topography and his magnum opus, Sepulchral Monuments in Great Britain. Basire also provided illustrations to a wide variety of publications, from caricatures after Hogarth to vignettes for popular novels, as well as frontispieces, typically the most important and prestigious illustration in the book. During the period of Blake's apprenticeship, Basire illustrated a number of popular travel accounts and was also one of a select number of London engravers entrusted with illustrating Captain James Cook's hugely successful voyage to the South Pole and around the world. In addition to the frontispiece, Basire contributed 6 engravings, including the large fold-out plate, The Landing at Malcolio. This was exhibited at the Society of Artists to much acclaim in 1778. Now, when taken with Basire's other work, these prints demonstrate the breadth of his technical skill as a reproductive engraver. He could employ firmly etched lines and simple hatching patterns to illustrate antiquarian subjects, or take a more sophisticated approach with the large historical plates that required smoother lines and intentionally detailed hatching and cross-hatching. He was also equally capable of the loose, heavily etched lines typical of popular caricatures, as his engraving of Hogarth's The Farmer's Return demonstrates. He could also use forceful curved lines, careful stippling, and elaborate cross-hatching necessary for portrait engraving. And Basire passed on all of these techniques, what were enigmatically described in the records of the Stationers' Company as the art and mystery of engraving, to his apprentices. The Register of Apprentices' Indentures records that Blake was apprenticed to Basire on the 4th of August 1772. During the previous decade, Basire had taken at least one other apprentice, a chap called Thomas Ryder, who began his apprenticeship on the 5th of August 1765. The wording of Ryder's apprenticeship indenture, this is the legal document that bound the apprentice to the master, stipulated that the apprentice shall faithfully serve his master, keep his secrets, and obey his lawful commandments. Engravers' apprentices also lived with their master's household as part of the family, and this was typically for a period of 7 years, during which time, according to the indenture, the apprentice was prohibited from committing fornication, matrimony, playing at cards, dice, tables, or any unlawful other games. They should not also haunt taverns or playhouses, nor absent themselves from their master's service, day nor night. In return, The master instructed the apprentice and provided meat, drink, apparel, lodgings, and all other necessities. In his apprentices, Basire appears to have selected young men who demonstrated a high degree of proficiency in drawing. For example, in 1766, the Society of Artists awarded Thomas Ryder 6 guineas for his drawing of a group of figures. And Thomas Ryder, as I've mentioned, was the apprentice that Basire took prior to Blake's apprenticeship. Basire would have also known about Henry Parr's drawing school, probably via his affiliation with the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. And it's possible that Parr's, on the advice of his brother William, directed Blake to Basire. William Parr's had provided drawings, some of which were engraved by Basire, to illustrate a number of tracts during the 1760s, including Ionian antiquities. When Blake began his apprenticeship, he overlapped with Ryder by about 3 months and was Basire's only apprentice until James Parker, who was 6 years Blake's senior, became an apprentice in August 1773. And as we know, and as I've mentioned, Blake and Parker went into business, albeit briefly, at the end of their respective apprenticeships. The Stationers' Company records and the Register of Duties does not show any evidence that Basire took on another apprentice until 1779. That is, when Blake completed his apprenticeship and was released from his indenture. Life as an apprentice involved long hours and at first comprised menial tasks such as cleaning the workshop, maintaining the etching and engraving equipment, preparing the copper plates and paper, and running errands. The quantity of work being produced by Basire between August 1772 and 1773 suggests, however, that Blake may have been fast-tracked to etching and engraving copper plates as early as 1773. Basire's workshop supplied 27 quarter-size illustrations for the 1772 and 1773 volume of the Transactions of the Royal Society, and 22 quarter-size illustrations for the second volume of the Society of Antiquaries Journal, Archaeologia. That was in 1773. The same year, Basire's workshop supplied all 6 illustrations for John Hutchinson's The History and Antiquities of the County of Dorset. And the same year as Blake himself dates what we consider today as his first attributable engraving, the first of 2 states of the plate known as Joseph of Arimathea among the rocks of Albion. Now, the figure on your left is the earliest. This is the first date. And this is an engraving, as Blake writes in the inscription there, after a figure from Francesco Rossi Salviati's copy of the Michelangelo's The Crucifixion of St. Peter. Now, the first date is undated, but the manuscript inscription in Blake's hand states that it was engraved when I was a beginner at Basire's. On the second state, Blake has engraved, as in size rather, engraved by W. Blake, 1773. Now, there are very clear differences between on the linear patterns between these both states. The first state, but what's important is the first state reveals that Blake was able to execute dense webs of hatching and cross-hatching as early as 1773. Now, the coherence, if you sort of examine these prints, the coherence between these systems of hatching is a bit inconsistent, but this is, Blake's earliest plates, so this is something we would expect. What it means is the tonal scale is limited when you compare it with the second state. Nevertheless, this first state demonstrates that Blake had learnt the basic systems of hatching to create form and tone within a year of his apprenticeship. Shortly after the completion of this engraving, trouble descended on Basire's studio. Writing in 1806, Blake's friend and first biographer, Benjamin Heath Malkin, recounts the event. 2 years passed over smoothly enough till 2 other apprentices were added to the establishment who completely destroyed its harmony. Blake, not choosing to take part with his master against his fellow apprentices, was sent out to make drawings. This circumstance he always mentions with gratitude to Basire, who said that he was too simple and they too cunning. As I mentioned earlier, with the exception of James Parker, the Stationers' Company records and Register of Duties do not indicate that Basire took on another apprentice until 1779. So Malkin's observations, which were almost certainly related to him by Blake, could refer to shop boys hired to clean the studio and equipment. They could also refer to Basire's own children, several of whom would later become part of the Basire business as engravers themselves, or possibly journeyman engravers hired to do some of the less prestigious work. Although there is no record that Basire ever during his career employed journeymen. Malkin goes on to reveal that Blake was then sent to Westminster Abbey. He was employed in making drawings from old buildings and monuments, and occasionally, especially in winter, in engraving from those drawings. This occupation led him to an acquaintance with those neglected works of art called Gothic monuments. There he found a treasure, which he knew how to value. He saw the simple and plain road to the style of art at which he aimed, unentangled in the intricate windings of modern practice. The monuments of kings and queens in Westminster Abbey, which surround the chapel of Edward the Confessor, particularly that of King Henry III, the beautiful monument and figure of Queen Eleanor, Queen Philippa, King Edward III, King Richard II, and his queen, were among his first studies. All these he drew in every point he could catch, frequently standing on the monument and viewing the figures from the top. The heads he considered portraits, and all the ornaments appeared as miracles of art to his Gothicized imagination. He then drew Aymer de Valence's monument, with his fine figure on top. Those exquisite little figures which surround it, although dreadfully mutilated, are still models for the study of drapery. But I do not mean to enumerate all his drawings, since they would lead me all over the old monuments in Westminster Abbey. Malkin then, rather enigmatically, adds, as well as over churches in and about London. Malkin's account has been taken as a primary authority for attributing some of the drawings of the monuments in Westminster Abbey signed by Basire to Blake. Based on Malkin's description, Blake would have Blake would have started sketching the tombs in Westminster Abbey in late 1774. Now, the reason that Basire needed the drawings of the monuments in Westminster Abbey was because he'd been commissioned by Richard Gough to provide illustrations for Gough's self-published sepulchral monuments in Great Britain. According to Gough's manuscript autobiography, he conceived this work about 1772 or 1773. In a letter of the 11th of December 1779, Gough offers a similar time frame for the inception of this project, telling his former tutor at Cambridge, the Reverend Michael Tyson, that a volume of Gothic architecture might have risen into existence 10 years ago. Gough also describes the project proceeding by degrees, which is borne out in his correspondence during the 1770s and leading up to the publication in 1786 of the first volume of sepulchral monuments. In 1809, Gough bequeathed his collection to the Bodleian Library, including the preliminary drawings, copper plates, proof impressions for this publication. These drawings not only include those executed by Blake, but also drawings of Gothic monuments in other London churches and churches all over Britain by other artists. When examined in this context, Blake's linear style, the style that he uses for Basire, is clearly identifiable from the looser style of the other artists. These drawings that we attribute to Blake include the portrait heads and tombs mentioned by Malkin, all of which have been signed by Basire. And it was common practice for the master of the engraving studio, in fact, any art studio, to sign any work coming out of the studio. What I will draw your attention to, though, is that almost all of the drawings that we can attribute to Blake have a signature formulation, which is a monogrammed JB, James Basire. So the J forms the sort of the vertical line of the B as it loops over. We don't tend to find that monogram JB signature on any of the other drawings. So based on the time frame when Blake was in the Abbey, as well as a couple of dates and some of the drawings, we can offer a rough reconstruction of Blake where Blake was in the Abbey over a particular period. The other thing I'd like to point out to you as well, while most of these drawings are pen ink wash drawings, a number of them also include watercolor washes, and in this case, gold leaf that were used for the to illustrate the decorations. So they were considered as, on the one hand, preparatory drawings, but highly finished preparatory drawings. Okay, so where was Blake? Well, in 1774, based upon what Malkin tells us and the dating of some of the drawings, he begins in the chapel of Edward the Confessor, which is behind the high altar. Here he would have sketched the tombs and effigies surrounding the Confessor's chapel, and these will be the tombs of Edward III, Henry III, Queen Eleanor, Queen Philippa, and Richard II and his queen. The following year, in 1775, Blake moves to the south side of the high altar, crossing that great cosmati pavement, and starts sketching the covered monuments to King Siebert and Countess Aveline, including the medieval wall paintings of Siebert and Henry III, traditionally considered to be the sort of founder and refounder, as it were, of Westminster Abbey. Siebert is on the left and King Henry is on the right. In 1776, Blake moved from the high altar to the north side of the Sicarium, sketching the monuments of Aymer de Valence and Edmund Crouchback. And in 1777, he spent time in St. Edmund's Chapel to sketch the tombs of John of Eltham and William de Valence. As you can see, Blake spent most of his time in a relatively small area of the Abbey, separated from the crowds of 18th century tourists that, just like today's visitors, fill the cavernous spaces of the nave and the transepts. Malkin remarked that Blake made these drawings by frequently standing on the monument. Now, there is a manuscript in annotation in pencil on one of the sketches of the tombs in the Gough collection that describes the drawing being taken by standing on the statue, which sort of confirms Malkin's description. Malkin also states that Blake engraved some of his preparatory drawings, especially in winter, and this has been used as the basis for attributing some, but not all, of the engravings after Blake's preparatory sketches to Blake himself, specifically the 6 portrait heads of monarchs. Questions hover, however, over the attribution to Blake of the rest of the engravings after his own drawings. This is partly because these engravings appear in the first volume of Sepulchral Monuments, which, as I mentioned earlier, wasn't published until 1786, which is 7 years after Blake completed his apprenticeship in 1779. Also, one of the engravings, as you can see here, this is the monument of Queen Eleanor after Blake's drawing, is dated 1783, which would seem to preclude Blake from being its engraver. The Gough correspondence in the Bodleian Library reveals that drawings of the tombs to illustrate Gough's volumes were being engraved by Basire's studio as early as October 1773. So this fits with the time frame that we've been sketching out for Blake's apprenticeship. If Malkin's statement that Blake made engravings after his own drawings is accurate, it is possible, or probably probable, that a number of previously unattributed copper plates after Blake's preparatory sketches may now be attributed to Blake. We know that Blake had learnt the basic techniques of line engraving by 1773. And on the versos of 3 copper plates in the Bodleian Library, after Blake's preparatory drawings, there are a series of hatching and cross-hatching patterns and other incised markings that suggest the hand of an apprentice. So this is one of the copper plates. On your left, you have the recto of the copper plate. This is the side of the copper plate that we printed. And on your right, that's the verso, the side that won't be printed. You can see the recto is highly polished. Well, some of the polish has remained. I mean, this is over 250 years old almost. Ready for printing. And on the back, it's fairly dirty and hasn't been cleaned too much. But you'll also notice there are some patterns. And here is a view of it a bit cleaner that we've worked up for you so you can see these patterns. Now, many of the copper plates after Blake's drawings have examples of repoussage. Repoussage is a technique that engravers use to correct and rework areas of the plates. In the case of the copper plates in the Bodleian Library, repoussage corresponds to areas where there are Latin inscriptions or the title of images or particular details such as faces or hands and feet. Now, it's sort of tempting to attribute repoussage to the hand of an apprentice rather than a master engraver like Basire, but it was common practice for plates to be corrected using a small ball point hammer. If you look at the image to the left, it's figure 12. And the image to the right, on the rightmost side of this image, just here is a cluster of, there's an optical illusion going on here, but this is a cluster of indentations made by the ball peen hammer. And the idea is you knock out the verso of the copper plate, so the recto of the copper plate is flattened so you can re-etch or engrave it. As we're here, I just want to point out this. This is also on the back of the copper plate. This was made using a burin, which is a tool that we see in figures 8 up here for gouging into the copper. And what it looks like is either the beginnings of a heavily fletched arrow or a quill. In other words, this is a deliberate set of incisions made by the engraver into the back of the copper plate. Also, while we're on this slide, I want to draw your attention to 17, figure 17. This is a dry point compass. That will be important later. So while there is ample evidence of repoussage indicating that plates were corrected during the process of engraving, it's not really evidence to attribute this to the work of an apprentice because this was standard practice for engravers to use repoussage. However, what is important is these copper plates also contain other markings that are quite difficult to see with the naked eye. Now, these linear patterns and markings can only really be seen with the assistance of magnification. And it wasn't until January 2022 when the Bodleian Library established a collaborative research and development partnership with the Factum Foundation. This was called Archeox, Analysis and Recording of Cultural Heritage in Oxford. And this collaborative research trialed a prototype three-dimensional imaging system called Selene. Now, what Selene does is record the microtopography of copper plates. Now, Selene uses a principle called photometric stereo that captures both color and surface data simultaneously at over 1 million pixels per square inch. So I was lucky enough to use Selene to make recordings to map the surface of the copper plates. And this made it possible to measure not only the width, but also the depth of etched or engraved features by examining cross-sections. So here is one of the images we captured. This is from Richard, a tile from Richard's plates. One of the things we can do to help us see these features is we can turn the color to grayscale. As you'll see, you can see the incised features a bit clearer. This is Queen Philippa, and we can also tilt the images so that we can look at cross sections, which gives you a sort of startling idea of the topography of the plate. And in this particular case, we're using grayscale on Philippa's to measure the depth and width of the etched and engraved lines. In the case of this particular plate, and what we did, we used this on all 6 oval portraits, and this is just one example. We were able to measure certain areas of the plate to see if there was a consistency in terms of depth and width of etched and engraved lines. The idea here is to see if there is consistency, then could we sort of attribute that to a single hand of the engraver. In the case of all the 6 oval portraits, we took particular areas by the nose, on the eyebrows, and in this case, this is the area in yellow that we're measuring, and this is the cross-section here. Now, just to give you an idea of the depth we're talking about, the measurement in this particular case reveals on all 6 oval portraits a consistent line depth of 40 microns, which is about almost sort of half the width of a human hair. What this does allow us to do is say that whoever etched and engraved these was consistent across all six copper plates. The Selene photometric system also revealed details about the incised patterns and markings on 3 particular copper plates after Blake's preparatory drawings. These versos, I should say, were never intended to be printed and appear to have been used as practice spaces for an apprentice to learn the basic linear patterns of intaglio graphics. Now, one of the first lessons for an apprentice was to engrave straight and curved lines. And the linear patterns we see are consistent with the linear patterns we see on the rectos of the copper plates and printed impressions of the 6 oval portraits, as well as the first state of the Joseph of Arimathea plate. On the verso of this plate, for example, much of the area is filled with a variety of linear patterns, including hatching and cross-hatching. So what we have here is a series of equidistant lines used by a burren, a poria burren. The ends here are tapered or squared, which indicates use of a burren. And what the apprentice engraver was doing was using distinct areas to practice distinct techniques. In the case of this one, it's equidistant linear lines. And on this plate here, on the left-hand side, you can see cross-hatching in a rectilinear area. There are occasions where the engraver goes beyond the rectilinear area. And then here, again, equidistant linear lines. The importance of creating equidistant lines, is you have a uniform space between them, is for the tonal effect of the engraving. Now, the most conspicuous incised markings are horizontal, vertical, parallel lines and hatching, some with semicircles and curved lines, which we'll see here. The majority of the parallel lines are equidistant, and as I said, they form these rectilinear areas, and they're consistent in line depth to about 250 to 270 microns, with widths of about approximately 250 microns. Now, the consistency of depth within each rectilinear area indicates that the engraver was practicing applying uniform pressure. And the consistency of width we see in the space suggests that the engraver was attempting to create this even tonal effect. Now, as we see later in Blake's certainly graphic work, particularly with the second state of Joseph of Arimathea, Blake does succeed in this. But by 1773, he was still working on creating an even tonal effect. There is also one cluster of sharp pointed parallel lines varying in depth as well. And here's another example of those engraved lines. And this one here. So what we have here is a series of lines varying in length from the outermost lines shorter that gradually increase in length to a central point, and they create the illusion, hopefully you can see this, of a circle. So again, the engraver is experimenting with equidistant lines to create the illusion of form and tone here. The cluster here reveals the engraver practicing line lengths with consistent depth and width. And this was crucial for Basire Studio, where lines and linear patterns were the foundation of the house style and would become for Blake a crucial tenet of his artistic theory. So learning how to incise equidistant parallel lines into the surface of copper plate would have been one of the first skills an apprentice needed to attain. Now, as we've seen, as I've mentioned with Blake's earliest engraving, he used parallel lines in combination with dense webs of hatching and cross-hatching to delineate the figure and the background of Joseph of Arimathea. Now, as this practice plate also indicates, there are several curved lines, approximately 300 microns in depth and 200 microns wide. Some of these appear to form vegetative shapes. Now, in the copper plates of the oval portraits, curved lines are often used to delineate features such as hair. In this case, this is the moustache of Richard II. Also, the beard of Henry III uses these curved lines as well. The vegetative shapes on the practice plate also anticipate Blake's use of vegetative tendrils in his illuminated books, such as the title page of Songs of Innocence. There are also a series of semicircles with puncture holes on their central axis, indicating the use of a compass. The ability to incise semicircles and circles would have been important for Basire's studio. A number of the engravings by Basire for publications sponsored by the Society of Antiquaries were architectural plans of classical monuments and include cross-sections of columns. We can also see the use of semicircles in the 6 oval portraits. And I should just explain here that the lower drawing in grayscale, what we've done is overdrawn the circles in blue highlights so you can see these circles. Now, these semicircles and circles are incised, shallowly incised, because Blake was using a dry point compass, that same type of compass I showed you earlier. So on the left here, this is the verso of one of the practice plates with the apprentice engraver practicing circles. And here on the right, these are the swirls of hair from Queen Philippa's plate. And now I should say that Blake used a compass in his post-apprenticeship commercial work to incise, in this case, semicircles. And this is a design in Henry Emlyn's A Proposition for a New Order in Architecture, published in 1781. So just a few years after Blake finishes his apprenticeship. And if you look very faintly at the top left, there are a series of semicircles which were made using a dry point compass. Now, those of you who are familiar with Blake's use of various motifs in his work, both visual and textual, the thought of a compass might make you somewhat excited because, of course, Blake was keen to depict compasses and circles in many of his works. Perhaps this is one of the most famous. This is obviously the frontispiece to Europe, where you have the Urizen figure, perhaps modelled on Edward III, circumscribed in this globe, maybe the sun, and holding the golden compass beneath him. Compasses also appear as a pictorial motif throughout his work, including the watercolor designs to Edward Young's Night Thoughts, as well as his watercolors for Thomas Gray's poem. Plate 12 of Jerusalem, we have both a compass and a circle, with a compass on the circle, on the sphere, held by this inverted figure. And perhaps the most famous is the color printed drawing from 1795, Kirker 1795, of Newton, which depicts a titular figure holding using a compass. Now, the verso of the copper plate after Blake's sketch depicting the monument of Richard II and Queen Anne also contains incised markings suggestive of apprentice work. Now, what you're looking at here is the verso in grayscale. I put it in grayscale so you can sort of make out the writing. There's a dry point inscription that reads Richard and his Queen. You can see the R there, Richard and his Queen. It's very shallowly etched, and it was probably etched to denote to the engraver working on this plate what the subject on the recto was. Now, this plate has extensive repoussage, which corresponds to the tomb below the effigies. There are some also small areas of hatching, most notably here. Now, right in the middle of the plate is what's called a plate maker's mark. Jones, based at number, this is 48, Hoff Lane, London. He was a plate maker during the time. Basire seems to have got most of his copper plate from Jones. And as you'll see in the first O of London, an engraver has done some cross hatching. Now, just to give you a sense of scale here, what you're looking at in that O is 1.5 millimeters in diameter. In other words, an engraver has hatched lines in here up to 50 microns deep with a sharp tip burring. Now, incising lines in confined spaces allows apprentices to practice using engraving tools in a very controlled way. In this case, it seems the apprentice was practicing in a sort of spontaneous, perhaps playful way. Now, such spontaneity and playfulness is further suggested in two other incised motifs. The first is a short shafted arrow or dart with extensive fletching and a triangular tip. This is approximately 18 millimeters in length and about 350 to 380 microns deep. The arrow was made with a burr-in with a flat tip, known as a scorper. As we know, arrows or darts are recurring pictorial and textual motifs in Blake's work, appearing in a variety of his watercolors, including from Milton's Paradise Lost series. In this particular one, Satan, Sin and Death. Satan appears at the gates of hell. Satan on the left is confronted by his son, Death, on the right, wielding a fiery arrow. In this one, we get the sun. This is the root of the rebel angels. The sun is drawing back his large bow armed with 7 arrows. In a number of his watercolor designs to Night Thoughts, Blake also depicts Christ armed with a bow, drawing an arrow from a quiver, and frequently depicts the figure of Death armed with short shafted arrows or darts, one of which he engraved for an illustrated edition of Young's poem in 1797. Arrows also appear frequently in Blake's poetry, including one of his most famous lines, "Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire," as well as one of his earliest poems. It appears in a war song to Englishmen from Poetical Sketches. Now, according to the advertisement for Poetical Sketches, Blake commenced these poems and dramatic fragments between his 12th and 20th year, indicating that some composition occurred during his apprenticeship. Blake's A War Song for Englishmen was probably intended to be included as a dramatic fragment in the King Edward the First drama in there, but it includes the line, and this, if you look on page 59, the second stanza, "The arrows of Almighty God are drawn." The recurrence of arrows in Blake's later pictorial, graphic, and poetic works indicates his long-held interest in this motif, and may relate to the depiction of an incised short-shafted arrow on the verso of the plate depicting the monument of Richard II and Queen Anne after Blake's preparatory drawing. If Blake was responsible for these incised markings on the verso of this plate, then this short-shafted arrow may be considered the first documented instance of this motif. The second motif on the verso of this plate is almost impossible to see with the naked eye due to the extensive repoussage. The Celine photometric system revealed, hidden amongst a cluster of the repoussage, a miniature face measuring approximately 18 millimeters in height, with consistent line depths of 100 microns. The face is a simplistic representation consisting of 2 eyes, partial nose, and lips, and is delineated using the linear patterns seen on the verso of the other plates, including curved lines, hatching, and cross-hatching. For instance, a series of curved lines above the eyes denote eyebrows, with an area of cross-hatching above the left eye between the second and third curved lines. The alternate use of hatching and cross-hatching in the eyes imbues the face with an expressive character. Now, repoussage covers and distorts much of the nose, indicating that the face was incised prior to the repoussage, and therefore before the recto of the plate was etched. The cross-hatching to the right of the nose is consistent with Blake's use of equidistant cross-hatching around the nose area in the 6 oval portraits and the Joseph of Arimathea plate, the first date. Unlike the 6 portraits of monarchs, however, this miniature face does not represent a specific model or individual beyond denoting the general concept of a human face. The lack of a continuous circle around the facial features suggests that the curved lines may have preceded the face, which may have been added as a doodle by a young apprentice. This is to say that, like the hatched O in the London of the platemaker's mark, what this indicates with its minute scale is an engraver capable of working in a controlled manner at a minuscule scale. Now, if this is the work of Blake, a young Blake learning his craft, what we're seeing is personal and private art, never intended to be printed or shown to everyone. But what the Celine system has allowed us to see for the first time in almost 250 years is this work, the work of a youthful Blake doodling away during the long apprentice's day. So that's the official end of the talk. If we have time, I have a couple of other things to show you if you have patience.
Yes, we'd love to see what you've got to show us, Mark. I'm on the edge of my seat here.
Okay. So in addition to the drawings of monuments in Westminster Abbey, as I mentioned earlier, Malkin states that Blake made drawings of monuments and churches, quote, in and about London. No such drawings by Blake have ever been identified. The Gough collection, however, contains a couple of drawings of tombs and effigies from churches in London that are candidates for attribution. In particular, there are a pair of drawings depicting the Purbeck stone effigy of Sylvester de Everdon, the Bishop of Carlisle. So on the left, this is the Purbeck stone effigy, and then this is the drawing in the Bodleian Library. And as you can see, it's signed Basire, Basire Dell, delineated. It's the Latin form for drawing. He was responsible for it. And if you can make out, it's got the JB monogrammed signature formulation, the same formulation that we find in Blake's other, or the drawings that we attribute to Blake in the collection. Now, the two drawings are pen and ink, and one is a plan view, one is a side view taken from the north face. Now, this Purbeck stone effigy, it took me about 6 months to track it down. It's in the Temple Church in London, just opposite the Inns of Court, as we know, and the High Court. These weren't, I should say, these two drawings were not engraved for sepulchral monuments, partly because the identity of the subject wasn't identified until the mid-19th century. So there may have been issues with identifying it and Gough deciding not to include this. What we can say is this drawing is extremely similar in style. These drawings are similar in style, and as well as the paper. The paper has the same chain lines and same watermark that we find in the other drawings attributed to Blake. And the similarity in style between this is the drawing from Temple Church on the left, and this is a drawing we can attribute to Blake of Countess Aveline. As you can see, the style is very similar. In other words, what I'm suggesting here is not only can we attribute this drawing to Blake, or these two drawings to Blake, but Blake at some point found himself in the Temple Church. Now, why is this important or interesting for us? Well, if you know anything about the Temple Church, it sort of symbolically relocates Jerusalem to London. It's based upon the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and obviously in Jerusalem. And when it was built in, or the nave part was built in the 11th century, the idea was that you're bringing Jerusalem to England, to London. And, one can't help but think that if Blake spent time in Temple Church, this must have informed aspects of his longest illuminated book, Jerusalem, which of course is about the emanation of the giant Albion, where the titular figure is the emanation of Albion. And I'm sort of simplifying here, but Albion is a personification of England, and the general narrative arc of the illuminated book, although it's highly complex, is the reunion of Albion and Jerusalem. Okay, I can stop there.
Okay. I'm on. Oh, Mark, thank you. That was the most extraordinary experience. The minute particulars certainly added up to the big picture. I thought that was a fantastically researched talk and brilliant images to accompany it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Just outstanding. You're getting some enormous praise in the chat. I'm not going to get in the way by asking you inane questions. I'm just going to step out of the way and let the audience ask what they wish. And if people would like to turn their cameras on at this point and use the raised hand in the react button at the bottom, and otherwise you can raise your hand visually if you're on screen, and we'll call you to speak as as you arrive. So, yes, lots of people appearing. And who would like to say something? I see Kerry's in the house. Any raised hands? Oh, yeah, Edward Ryan.
Actually, I was just waving to somebody else.
Fantastic. Oh, yes, Pen. Yeah.
How confident are you that the monogrammed JB is reflects Blake's work?
That's a really great question. It's I confess when I'm in the Bodleian Library and I'm looking at these drawings, I am 99.9% confident, and then I get less confident the further away I am from the Bodleian Library. What I will say is that there is consistency, right? We do know that you know, it was standard practice for anything coming out of a master studio to be signed by the master. So this was, you know, we wouldn't, in other words, we wouldn't expect Blake to be signing any of his apprenticeship work. I mean, Basire has a reputation that he's sort of carefully developed over years. So, and he wouldn't allow anything that doesn't have his name on to sort of come out of his studio. And conversely, anything that comes out of his studio has to meet his standard and also have his name on his sort of printer, if you will. But what I will say is that there are other drawings in there that sort of in this collection that predate and postdate the period of Blake's apprenticeship that are signed Basire, but they often, well, I can't think at the moment of any example that doesn't have, they don't, in other words, they don't have the monogram. The drawings that date from Blake's period do have the monogram. Now, one of the other reasons I raise this is because we know that Blake himself uses a WB monogram with the swirl for his own. So it's very tempting to, I mean, it's circumstantial evidence, but it's tempting to.
I was going to say circumstantial evidence. Yeah, it's very, very interesting, though. Fascinating. Thank you so much for all your work.
Thank you, Pen.
We have William Honer. No.
Hi, from Vancouver in Canada. Really interesting, and I particularly appreciate your giving us a sense of what it was like as a young man to be in that environment and so on. That's kind of a naive question. For someone who does have artistic abilities, how difficult is it to learn to work creatively in reverse, if you will, from left to right, in terms of, as I understand, engravers must have to learn? That would itself seem very difficult to me. Any comments on that part of the learning and so on?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, one thing I will say is, and I should have stressed this a bit more in the talk, that before Blake goes to Basire's, he spends 4 years at Henry Pars's drawing school. Now, this was seen at the time as the sort of, if you wanted to attend the St. Martin's in the Field Drawing Academy, which is the precursor to the Royal Academy, you had to go to Pars's drawing school first, right? And so he spends 4 years there. So he's clearly an extremely accomplished draftsman before he even gets to Basire. And also, this is another aspect of the research I haven't managed to fit into this talk. It's too much to talk about. Basire put a premium on his apprentices as draftsmen. So he wouldn't take anybody. We know that from the records, and looking at the apprentices that he did have. You had to be, your ability as a draftsman had to be fairly superior, right, to be accepted by Basire. Now, this idea of doing sort of reverse, I think one of the things we can see in some of Blake's earlier works is there is inconsistency when he's in some of his earlier engravings. And he seems to struggle, at least initially, particularly with mirror writing. And Jerry Bentley has wrote a lot about this, and Sandy Gawley as well. In the case of, if you look at the Blake's lettering, for example, in those two early illuminated books, the tractates, there is all religions are one and there is no natural religion. It's slightly awkward and a bit crude, but then when you look at obviously Jerusalem and Milton, you know, later, it's the fine copperplate hand using a very fine tip brush, which is slightly confusingly called a pencil back in those days, used to write these. So it did take him a while to develop that skill. We can sort of see that. But there are also sort of various methods for sort of doing this reverse. And Joe Viscomi's, well, most of his work, particularly the last two books, sort of talk about this in more detail. So there were ways that he could be helped with transferring the original and putting it in reverse, if that helps, William. But
Yeah,
it's a hard skill to learn.
And is there, I understand Blake was right-handed. Is there any, in just in terms of your experience with engravers in general, are left or right-handed people or people who are in between in terms of their symmetry of dexterity more skilled at this intuitively, or do you know anything about that?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, what I can say is etching is slightly different because you don't need, when you're etching a plate, you're not putting the same amount of sort of pressure on a plate. You've covered it in ground and you're using a sort of etching needle to remove the ground, and whatever's removed, that's what will be etched. But when you come to engraving, and what I was showing you, those versus those copper plates, they were all engraved, and that you have to be quite strong to do that. So I mean, we know that copper is quite, very malleable, soft metal. So the way that they would have the copper, if I can take this, using my own book as a and my burin, you would hold the burin in the palm of your hand and push it away from you, and then you would turn the plate rather than the burin as you're doing it. But you'd have to be quite strong and consistent in doing this, right, when you're manipulating the plate, and obviously very coordinated. Now, what I was attempting to show you with those lines is, it's extraordinary if we're thinking of this as a practice plate, that this, and you have to practice, an apprentice has to learn his trade by practicing on copper. Those lines are so, I mean, when I'm throwing out numbers like 200 microns, 80 microns, it's somewhat abstract, but they're very shallow, very difficult to see with the naked eye. But the amount of control that you have to have, not only to make the incision, but to continue it along the, and then if you're doing curved lines, particularly, or those vegetative shapes that we saw, the level of skill there is, I mean, it's scarcely sort of difficult to comprehend in this sort of day and age, without the magnification that we have today to help us do that.
Thank you. Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
I was checking out my Bentley, Mark, and I think he says that at least two of Blake's friends commented on how well he did end up doing the backwards writing. I think it was Cumberland and Richmond, maybe.
Yeah.
But it is extraordinary, isn't it? I have enough trouble writing in a forward direction. I really do. Jane Montague has asked a question in the chat. Jane, if you'd like to put your camera on and ask it, otherwise I can read it out for you, whichever you prefer. Oh, this isn't Jane. That's Ramazan. I'll read out Jane's question and then we'll go to Ramazan. Was there any judgment about becoming an engraver rather than a painter after attending such a prestigious drawing school? Was it purely money that directed Blake's path artistically?
Again, that's a great question. The answer is yes. There was a distinction between being a painter, which was and an engraver. Engravers were seen as sort of purely mechanical. It was a mechanical process. As engravers didn't necessarily see themselves like that. We have to remember that Blake was, and Basire, they were reproductive engravers, so they're not creating original art. They're copying other works for the most part. And that's, as we know, how Blake made his living, as a reproductive copy engraver. So there is a distinction. If you're a painter, it's certainly more prestigious, and not just more prestigious, but you're considered an artist, right? And it wasn't until much later that engravers were even allowed to join the Royal Academy, for example, and they had for about 10 years their own separate society where they could exhibit things. So it's certainly the case to say that engraving wasn't seen in the same sort of social professional register as painters. And to answer the second part of the question, I think it's largely due to how much faith we want to put into some of these sort of later anecdotal um, episodes of Blake's life. I mean, I included the part from Gilchrist about William Wynne Ryland, but you know, other than Gilchrist, I can't find any evidence that Blake was first apprenticed, or was Ryland was first approached, and then they went to Basire. But what I can say is that there seems to be a sort of professional relationship between Henry and William Parr's, Henry Parr's drawing school, and the artist engraving community. So it wasn't uncommon for Henry Parr's to arrange, I suppose, what we would call today sort of internships. So he would send students off to go and sketch in the Duke of Richmond's gallery, or go and place them with a painter for a week or an engraver for a week. And what we know is that Basire worked closely with William Parr's, Henry Parr's brother, in the 1760s on a series of these architectural and publications, mainly about for the Antiquities of Athens and Ionian Antiquities. Well, the other thing I suppose that obviously for Blake's family, money was, I guess, an issue. And if William Wynne Ryland is charging £100, how much would a portrait painter who took apprentices charge? We know that George Romney, for example, he didn't take apprentices because he was one of the most celebrated, famous portrait painters of the day. But others, you know, did take apprentices, and they, you know, charged much more than that.
Yeah, I
So it can't be
suspected the
more.
same. Yeah. Fortunate for us, anyway.
It is.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Ramazan, our dear friend Ramazan.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. And my question is maybe an obvious one, but I wonder, how much do you think Basire had an effect on Blake's later dogged, if I say, going after of outlines? Because outlines were very significant for Blake. And I think since being apprenticed to Basire at an early age, it must have had an effect on him because of his outdated style.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you read the descriptive catalogue, for example, and some of the comments he makes in his letters, some of the annotations to, you know, Joshua Reynolds, right? Blake develops this kind of aesthetic theory that's focused on what he calls the bounding line, and that's in opposition to the sort of prevalence of the fashion for oil painting, what he calls the blotting and blurring of the sort of the Flemish, right? And also in his own in the field of engraving, the sort of rise of this stippling and the mezzotint and later aquatint. It's not to say that Blake, you know, can't do these techniques, but his artistic credo, which I'm certain, as you say, is informed by his time with Basire, looks to a very different, more mid-18th century, more early 18th century aesthetic, keyed in with the primacy of the line. For him, the line is everything, it seems.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now we have David Fallon.
Hey Mark, lovely to see you and hear from you again, and love to for all the folks. That was really fascinating. I really enjoyed that, and felt like I learned a lot there. I'm afraid towards the end I was called away by an upset child, so I think I missed something crucial. So you would, because you mentioned early on that Blake, which is something I'd not picked up on, that he didn't just go to Westminster Abbey, he went to other churches, and then you had the final image of the bishop at the end. I just wondered, were you able to sort of find other churches beyond the temple? Did you mention those? And I just missed that part of the talk.
I didn't, but I think there are two other churches. Now, I'm slightly hesitant to say anything just at the moment. But I think there are 2 other London churches that he went to sketch a couple of tombs in. In other words, there are more drawings. I don't know how much I should be saying at this day. There are more drawings that haven't been attributed to Blake of tombs in other churches that are, I think, by Blake. But I'm still doing the research to make sure it's bulletproof, as they say. But I'm pretty confident that he went to Temple Church and spent time in Temple Church. And I don't think it was just those 2 drawings. There are a number of other drawings of other effigies in Temple Church that he sketched. What's interesting now is that the other effigies in Temple Church, one of the reasons I didn't show you any of the drawings or the photos is because Temple Church was a victim of the Luftwaffe during the Blitz, and several of these effigies are sort of shattered in pieces. So these drawings are sort of one of the surviving, I guess, visual records of these effigies. But there's still a bit more work to do. This is all to say, yes, he did go to Temple Church, and I will be certain or not certain in another sort of 6 or 8 months whether he went to the other 2 London churches. Sorry to be a bit cagey.
No, I mean, I totally understand, but you're a better person than me. I'd be like, oh, yeah, he definitely went. But, you know, obviously he kind of adds a lot of grist to the mill of his kind of love of the Gothic more widely than just something he was kind of told to go and look at. But thanks for that. It's really fascinating.
You're welcome. It's
research.
great to see
I look forward to reading more.
Well, one of the things I can add to that is when we think about Blake's illuminated books, particularly the way that Blake integrates his sort of vegetative designs with the text, with these interlinear motifs that sort of entwine themselves within the text, we tend to think of illuminated manuscripts, which he may have been exposed to in Westminster Abbey in the archives. You know, he was there. But looking at these tombs, when you look at the tombs, you see how the decorative vegetative motifs, particularly, are thinking of Countess Aveline's tomb and a couple of the others in Westminster Abbey, mirror that use of vegetative motifs that intrude upon and entwine themselves in the text. So not just in the case of illuminated manuscripts, I think maybe we should, when we're thinking about sort of precursor for Blake's idea of what he's doing with these interlinear motifs in his illuminated books, be thinking about the tombs that he was sketching in Westminster Abbey, because some of those do contain these motifs that entwine on these Latin inscriptions. So thank you for reminding me about that. Good to see you, Dave.
You have to come back and reveal all, Mark, when you can, and put
Saving
it
for 2027, big reveal.
Yeah. And here's Kerry, our beloved Kerry, Vice President.
Okay. I mean, that was such an extraordinary talk, and so rich that no way can I ask questions about it. I have to baffled by it, so I have to move on to something you might think irrelevant, but it's other people have brought it up. Basire himself. What puzzles me is that nobody seems to pay any attention to the fact that Basire is a Huguenot. He was baptized in the French church in Soho Square, though his own children are baptized into the Church of England, St. Andrew's, Holborn. But Basire is a Huguenot. I can't remember the name now, but the master to whom Blake's elder brother James is apprenticed is also a Huguenot. And then William marries Catherine Sophia, whose family are quite possibly Huguenot. Certainly I can find there are names that look like her grandparents among the French prophets. So what does that mean? That means, to me, it thinks we can forget the Ryland story, that there's a family link to choosing a Huguenot master. Does that make any sense to you?
It does. It makes more sense than the William Wright. I mean, it's a nice story and it speaks to sort of the Blake mythology, but I don't think it's entirely true.
Mm. Yeah, and what does Blake know of Huguenot religious life? Would Basire have taken him to the French church?
I mean, 7 years you're living there. I'm sure.
Yeah, you have to go to church with your master.
I'm sure.
No way you can avoid it.
Yeah.
But that's, I don't know if is that a question?
Yeah,
or
no, is that church? Is it in Fetter Lane? Is that
no? The Huguenot church is, well, the French church in London is in Soho Square.
Soho Square? Okay.
Fetter Lane, on the other hand, is where you find the Moravians.
That's right. Yeah, that's
So, yes, in a way that sort of aspects of Blake's religious life can be read on a map of London. It's I don't know what to make of it. Better stop there.
No, but thank you, Kerry. That's an aspect I haven't sort of thought of. And as Penn put in the quote, do we know that Basire even went to church? I haven't found yet any evidence. I mean that the Richard Goddard, who's sort of descended from the Basire family, published a monograph a couple of years ago on the Basires. So I'm sort of trying to rack my brains if he says anything about the Huguenots in there. He does, but I'm not entirely sure, or I can't remember at any rate, whether or not they were regular churchgoers, or was it more like here I'm thinking on territory I'm sort of more comfortable with, where William Haley, who also lived on Great Queen Street, but he would conduct his own sort of services and read prayers to his household, so it may have been something along those lines. But that's thanks, Kerry. That's food for thought.
Thank you for a terrific talk. Yeah.
And Jennifer Jesse has a question.
Yeah, this is a totally speculative remark, just a remark. And this was a fantastic talk. My head is exploding. But this follows up on Ramazan's question about the influence of Basire on Blake's aesthetic philosophy. And you can't help but wonder if he had been apprenticed to someone else, would the art we know be totally different? I mean, nobody would know, but I mean, because of youthful influences, Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, one of the things that we tend to think about with Blake is the sort of influence of Raphael and Michelangelo on his work, right? And typically that's been sort of ascribed to, well, he was Blake himself, collected prints, he drew at the Royal Academy, he was probably exposed to it there. But what I suggested in the talk here and in the sort of longer work that this will eventually become is through Basire. Basire was in the Vatican sketching I mean, now I'm entering into speculative territory, but it wouldn't be beyond the realm of sort of speculation to imagine that Basire would have told Blake about his time in Rome. And we do know that there was a very early attempt to send Blake to Rome on the Grand Tour, as it were, that sort of fell through. Flaxman was partly involved in that. So I imagine that Blake would have seen drawings or engravings. He certainly saw the stoning of Saint Stephen by Basire after Raphael. So I think the influence, that sort of formative experience, those 7 years living there, learning your trade, but also being exposed to this art from Rome that your master has seen and has made copies of, and probably Basire. Sadly, I've been sort of talking to Richard Goddard about this, trying to trace Basire's own sketchbooks right from this period, because we know he had sketchbooks. If we could sort of get hold of those, it would give us more of an idea of what Blake would have been exposed to during this period. But I think I'm safe in saying that perhaps one of Blake's first exposure to Raphael, to Michelangelo, was via Basire, because we know Basire was in the Vatican with Dalton sketching these things and had sketchbooks full of these full of these designs. And also that one of the other things about his time with Basire and also in Westminster Abbey, later in his life, 1809, 1810, 1811, he sort of conceptualized this idea of these portable frescoes that you can move around, these sort of great public works of art. And that seems to be, he seems to be thinking there of maybe his experiences in Westminster Abbey, but more particularly this idea of what Basire had seen and sketched in the Vatican. Raphael's great sort of decorations for the cardinals, the Pope's apartment, for example. For Blake, these could be ambulant. You could then sketch them and then move them around to particular places. Not that this is a sort of unique idea. James Barry, did the wonderful decorations, sort of interior decorations as well. But I think a lot of the ideas that we have about Blake and Blake's theory of art, the sort of genesis of all this, I think, can be his experience with Basire, both as an aesthetic theory, and not just an aesthetic theory, because it becomes a kind of a life theory for him, this idea of the bounding line and determinate shapes, determinate images, but also is key to his aesthetic theory. And the other thing that I suppose the last thing before I move on is that we can see, and in a sort of longer presentation, we can see the aesthetic influence, compositional influence of those early preparatory sketches throughout Blake's other pictorial work. I mean, most obviously it's in the watercolors for the grave designs, but several of the Bible watercolors, the Paradise Lost. Anytime you see a recumbent figure, all right, it's harking back to these effigies that he wrote. The Canterbury Pilgrims copper plates. Hang on a second. The Canterbury Pilgrims copper plate. I'm not sure if this is going to. Maybe I have to put my head in the screen. So the Canterbury Pilgrims copper plate. Obviously the Gothic architecture that Blake was familiar with, but this whole composition here is largely derived from one of Basire's large engravings that the Field of the Cloth of Gold, where Henry VIII is processing from the French town of Guy to meet King Francis. The whole composition of the procession is based upon one aspect of that large-scale engraving. Now, that engraving Basire worked on from 1772 to 1774, and it's the largest integral copper plate engraved in the 18th century. And there are aspects of that plate, again, I'm still working on this, so I'm slightly tentative here, that I think Blake possibly worked on. And the plate itself is still in existence. It's one of the few copper plates we have of Blake's left. It's in the Society of Antiquaries. And that's one of the next phases of this research. We're actually, next month, we're using the Selene system on this copper plate. So there may be more news. I'm hoping for another miniature happy face. Or maybe some more arrows of desire on the back. But if we find anything, we'll publish it and let you know.
Can't wait to read your research. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There'll be a whole series of Blake emojis, I think, Mark. That's what we're looking at, isn't it? He's been texting. We've got 3 more questions. If you're happy, Mark, we can just hear those 3, and then we'd better call it a day because we're sort of on our time. So first up is Leon Conrad.
Thank you very much. Great talk. I have a quick question for you, Mark, and for any of the Blake community out there. Does anyone know whether, in relation to the question about where Blake went to church, whether Blake attended an office of Tenebrae at all, at any point in his life?
I don't know, Leon. I defer to the Blake community.
Obviously something to research. Thank you.
if I might intervene and say, the one thing we have from J.T. Smith is that Blake didn't enter any place of worship in the last 40 years of his life. So, I don't know. So, yeah, I don't think he would have. So.
Seems unlikely. John Reardon, my fellow trustee.
Hello. Thanks, Stephen.
I
I just wanted to follow up on the Basire influence from a slightly different angle. I'd always sort of, because of the way I think Gilchrist and onwards kind of write about Basire as a sort of almost quite sort of old-fashioned, conservative engraver who's, you know, had sort of been surpassed supposedly by these other styles. So I'd always had this kind of idea, sort of presumed that he was a sort of conservative with the small c person, if you like, or sort of establishment kind of figure. But I'm sort of half remembering something I read in the Goddard monograph that you mentioned. Am I right in thinking he had sort of, I suppose, sort of respectable radical sympathies, or even sort of Republican sympathies? I think there being something about that.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, Richard mentions that in his book, and I think the choice to move maybe from Fetter Lane to Great Queen Street, or at least staying Queen Street with its sort of progressive, at the time, progressive flavor, speaks to that, right? And that's another sort of milieu that perhaps we don't consider when we're thinking about, we think about Blake as an apprentice engraver there, or in Westminster Abbey, and now the Temple Church, but we don't tend to think about that immediate community that, so that you've got Drury Lane Theatre on one end, the Inns of Court on the other, but then you have this very progressive, but at least a sort of flavor of progressiveness with lectures about equality for women, anti-slavery pamphlets and meetings taking place, right? And this is in the 1770s. I think there's a reason he sort of situates and stays in that location. And he also has a shop there. So he's clearly selling his prints to people in that sort of area. So I think, you know, you're right, and Richard's right as well, that there's more of a progressive, socially, maybe politically. I wouldn't go as far as calling him a sort of radical in the vein of sort of Thomas Paine or you know, Hardy or any of the London Corresponding Society. But I think one distinction I suppose we have to make is that his style of engraving was seen as old-fashioned, and that's because people like Ryland had introduced the French style of engraving, the stippling, and then mezzotint, and then shortly thereafter, when does aquatint come in? 1780s. Aquatint comes in, and like any, as we know in our own time, any new sort of phenomenon that comes in, it's bright and shiny and new, and sort of seeks to replace the old. But what we can say about Basire, that he can do a variety. There is even sort of mezzotint in some of his engravings. Now, one of the things I didn't get to show you because of time, I sort of cut it out, was Basire did a series of engravings for Charles Rogers, his publication. The title of the publication is Engravings in Imitation of Sketches. This is a sort of 2-volume, highly prestigious work with a very short subscription list. Now, these plates, they use mezzotint stippling techniques. So it's not that Basire couldn't do these techniques. For him, commercially, he makes more money from the sort of older fashion, what they considered the older fashion line engraving, and because he's, you know, engraver to the Society of Antiquaries and to the Royal Society, that's his sort of meat and drink. So I think, contrary to say what Gilchrist and some of the other early biographers think about Basire, I don't think it's correct to think of him as both conservative in terms of his sort of politics, in terms of his sociability, nor is it strictly true to say he's conservative in terms of his sort of aesthetic, because he can do a broad range of things. It's just the things that make him the money that keep his business afloat use that very linear style of engraving, which sort of Blake picks up on as his artistic credo. And I will also say, you know, with Blake, without Basire and training under Basire, we wouldn't have the Canterbury Pilgrims plates. We wouldn't have I mean, what I think of Blake in terms of his masterpiece in graphic arts and intaglio arts are the Job designs. They are sort of masterpieces of the form. I don't think they would exist if Basire didn't train Blake, because you can see in terms of the techniques that Blake is using here, that he's honed, you can trace them directly back to what he learned at Basire Studio. And some of those images of those copper plates I was showing you, they were the exact lines that Blake uses 30, 40 years later to make the Job series of Job engravings.
Yeah.
But that's a great question. Thanks, John.
Fascinating. Thank you very much.
Our presidents, Juliet and Mark Rylance, are very keen to do a Blake Society event in the Temple Church. I think they know something. Mark, definitely they're onto it. And Suzanne Sklar now. How nice to see you.
It's really nice to be here. And Mark, this was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. I just have a question that may be off outside of the range of what you're doing, but does anyone know if the William Law edition was in James Basire's possession? Because in Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake says, Paracelsus and Burma appeared to me. The American War began. The American War began in 1775. So Blake must have been hanging out with Basire at that time. And he praises the designs in the Law edition. So I'm wondering, does anybody know what kind of books Basire might have read?
We don't. Richard Goddard is the person to ask about this, but yeah, it'd be great. Like Haley, if we had like we do for Haley, if we had a catalog. But I mean, Basire clearly had books, right? We just don't know what. Yeah. And I mean, I'm desperate to get hold of his sketchbooks. They existed, and I don't know where they are now. If anyone does, I'm all ears.
Be nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Susan. Are you in the States still?
No, I'm in London.
Wonderful.
Where are you?
Kansas.
Ah, click your heels 3 times.
I will.
I was just thinking ruby slippers. Mark, thank you. You've certainly transported us to other worlds in fantastic detail, and it's just so impressive. And I can tell by the response from the audience tonight that you absolutely held us spellbound.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the
incredible. Yeah. So thank you so much. Our next event is actually with Ramazan, who we saw tonight, and he's talking about the influence of Milton's L'Allegro and Il Penseroso on songs of innocence and of experience. So that will be an interesting one. Mark, thanks again, and perhaps show our appreciation in the normal way with either silent or audio turn. No, better just silent clapping, I think. Thanks again, Mark. That's absolutely brilliant. We'll be in touch.